Hi, and welcome to DataKind's webinar today. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're talking generative AI, the tech opportunities and risks. So as you join us, feel free to type into the chat, introduce the organization you're representing or where you're joining us from. We're excited to have you today, and we'll get started in just a moment. We see folks joining us. We're really excited to have this conversation with you all today. DataKind's webinar on generative AI, the tech opportunities and risks. So as you come in, introduce yourselves into the chat, what organization you represent if you'd like to share, or just where you're joining us from. We're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna share just a few reminders. We are live streaming this webinar on LinkedIn, pretty exciting. We're also recording the webinar, so have no fear. We will be sending out the recording to participants along with PDF slides afterwards. And if you're here in the Zoom room, you should notice a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This is where we would like for you to place your questions so that we can make sure that we're tracking and responding to them as we go along. So here's our agenda for today. As you can see, we're in the welcome portion, and we'll follow up with an intro to DataKind. And so after that, we'll get into today's topic. We'll go through a panel discussion, a Q&A portion with closing remarks. We have our learning objectives here, as we recognize that we have a variety of attendees, both technical and non-technical. This webinar is for those within the social impact organization sector, for them to learn about generative AI and how it's applied across the social sector. So we want to make sure we're level setting today's conversation by sharing with you what we hope to accomplish. Knowing what generative AI is, how it can be applied, how it could bring opportunity across the social sector, but also understand its risks and ethical considerations. These are our speakers today. I'm Shana, your host. Next, we have John Harnisher, head of research, where John brings over 200 years of experience. That would be impossible, John. 20 years of experience as a leader and researcher in the field of data modeling, analytics assessment, and organizational development. Before joining DataKind, John led research, data science, machine learning, and assessment functions for Kaplan and AI Solutions, for example. John is a strong believer in developing and completing research and data science projects that positively impact society. He holds a BA in psychology from Connecticut College, Master of Science in Psychology, IO Psychology from NYU, and a PhD in organizational psychology. Michelle Lee is a PhD candidate in computer science at Cambridge Computer Lab, where her research focuses on ethics and fairness issues in machine learning systems. She also leads the development of trustworthy AI solutions for a Big Four professional services organization. Michelle is an active volunteer for DataKind at the UK and currently sits on their ethics committee. We also have Matthew Harris, our head of data science here at DataKind, bringing more than 20 years of experience in software development, product management, and data science leadership. He oversees our product development and data science strategy. He strongly believes in ethical and equitable data as a power for good in the world, and has extensive track record also as a volunteer before joining us as head of data science. He has a Bachelor of Science in Astronomy and PhD in Physics. So it makes for some amazing ability to be outside in Vermont, as he always likes to do in the shivering winter, taking photos of the stars. So with that said, we are going to go into a little bit about DataKind. We're a global nonprofit organization, and that's been our mission since the organization's inception, harnessing the power of data science and AI in service to humanity. And a key role that we play is to bridge the gap between technologists and the social sector. We do that by connecting pro bono expert data scientists with change makers to design innovative solutions to tough challenges. We're able to do this work thanks to our global network of over 30,000 members that come from over 98 countries. We've done more than 350 projects for impact over the last decade and delivered over 35 million in pro bono services. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt for the next portion of our webinar.
Thanks, Shana. Hello, everybody. Nice to see everybody on today. It's really exciting. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of generative AI and some of the applications in the social sector from a practitioner's point of view. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So my goodness, what a 6 months we've just had. I'm sure it has not escaped most of the people on this webinar that there's been a huge influx of activity in generative AI. And some of these names are probably quite familiar to you now. They're becoming household names. ChatGPT. My mum knows about ChatGPT, so that's a great measure. But there are other superstars that came out in the last 6 months, such as DALL-E 2 for image generation, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and others. However, go to the next slide, please. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And even what I'm showing on this slide is a little bit lower down from the tip. This field is on fire right now. So generative AI is, there's a huge amount of investment. There are a large number of models being developed and architectures across lots of different modalities and domains. So different ways of generating generative AI. And in addition to this, as you've probably all picked up on already, some of the big vendors such as Google and Microsoft are racing to include generative AI within their products. So we go to the next slide, please. So what is it? Well, first thing, I thought I would go and ask ChatGPT what generative AI is. And it's a subset of artificial intelligence that is able to generate new content. So images, text, music. The really beguiling thing is that, especially with text, this content is generated in a form that looks very realistic, either as if a human had created that content. So if you please go to the next slide. So text generation. So here's an example, again, using ChatGPT. These large language models, which are the generative AI models used for text, they are trained on massive amounts of data. So basically, most of the internet is scraped and used as input into those models, as well as a range of libraries and other kind of text content. Most of them leverage or use an architecture called the transformer architecture. And this is a huge advance in AI. It's basically able to learn deep structure in content. So, and by that I mean, if you're a human being and somebody mentions a sentence, say 2 minutes ago, and they mention something that refers to that sentence, you as a human being are able to link those two things together. Transformers do essentially the same thing. So when you enter a piece of text using a massive amount of data and what they've learned about the structure of language, they're in effect completing the text by providing additional output that is the most probable set of words that should follow your input. And in this case, you can see I've asked it to tell me about generative AI in the voice of Cookie Monster, and it's able to do that. So if we could go to the next slide. So image generation, I think many of you have probably been able to, you've probably seen spacemen on horses coming from DALL-E 2. That's a ubiquitous image that's been flying around the internet. I thought I would do something slightly different here and use DALL-E 2 for image editing, which is a beta feature of DALL-E 2 right now. So in this image, I'm able to remove part of the image, and just using a single phrase of text, it is able to complete that image and give me a nice big long beard. But it just illustrates the power and the realism of these generated images just from a very short cue, this one sentence as input. So if we go to the next slide. So an emerging art or skill, if you like, is something called prompt engineering. So these large language models have become so complex, they have what are called emergent skills or emergent features. In this case, you can actually train the model, well, not train, you can provide an example, and a large language model will take that example and use it in your completion. This is brand new. This is amazing capability. Previously, you would have to retrain models, a very expensive exercise, but you can actually instruct it on the fly. So in this example, I give an example, but importantly, I break down the calculation into steps in my example. And I provide before that a magic phrase. It turns out that let's think this step by step is a very effective phrase. From this, there are research papers on this. And in providing that worked example, now when I ask my question at the bottom, I finish off my prompt with let's think this step by step, that magic phrase, and the large language model completes my text and it copies what I did. It goes through and it breaks down the calculation. So this might seem quite trivial, but think about what it's doing. Just using the language on the internet, it has essentially developed this emergent skill where it's able to do basic mathematics, which is a very exciting area of research. But this prompt engineering is a field unto itself. And similarly, you can prompt the image models to produce images, and how you prompt them, again, is important. There's even a secondary market now in prompts. So if we could please. So that's all magic and amazing, fantastic. And at first blush, you look at the output of generative AI models and it's just amazing. However, there are risks and concerns. So being trained on internet data, whether it's for images or for text, the internet is and contains bias and prejudice, obviously. So that is a grave risk and concern with generative AI. Transparency. So many of these models, such as DALL-E 2 and ChatGPT, are produced by vendors, and the same goes for Bing implementations of OpenAI's models, or Bard from Google. There is little transparency. We do not have access to the models themselves. Copyright. So when you train image generation models on images, and specifically labeled images on the internet, there are concerns there around copyright, and there are already some lawsuits in progress from artists and photographers who believe that the images generated are basically reproducing their own work. Environmental impact. So these models are trained in huge football field-sized data centers, in cloud computing data centers, which actually have a measurable environmental impact in terms of cooling those data centers. There is a counter-argument that as we move to foundation models, we may actually reduce the footprint of AI training, so people don't have to train their own bespoke models, but the question is still very open on that. Deep fakes, as you saw, I don't have hair or a beard, but those images earlier would suggest that I do. The barrier to being able to produce deep fakes has reduced immensely. If I can just enter a single sentence to change an image, and by the way, that's images, video, if not already happening, is very close behind. And then the big issue, which I'll come on to in the next slide, is hallucination. As I said earlier, one of the most, perfect. So one of the most amazing things about these models, and particularly language models, is that the responses can be so convincing. So if you're interacting with ChatGPT and you're asking it questions about all sorts of things, you'll get amazing results. And the majority of the time, those results may be accurate and complete. However, occasionally it will turn around and it will give you an answer in the same convincing voice, and it will be stone cold wrong. This is quite a benign example here, where I've asked it about types of generative AI, and it's said, oh, you can use reinforcement learning. Actually, this isn't generative AI, but see how the voice is so convincing. And so this, in effect, makes it very dangerous, because as human beings, we are conditioned to develop trust. So when an algorithm starts responding to us in a human-like fashion, there is a danger that we will believe everything that it says. So hallucination is a very important issue. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this list is by no means exhaustive, but actually I believe the foundation models, the research in that, will continue over time. So that, for example, the language models beneath some of these solutions, but on top of that, the framework around it, the investment at the moment, for example, with OpenAI, ChatGPT is not yet available as a commercial product. ChatGPT has been launched as a pilot with the aim of putting guardrails around those models to address some of the issues that I just mentioned in the previous slide. By having 100 million users use ChatGPT and doing exactly what I did on the previous slide and say, hang on, that's wrong, that is generating human in the loop training data. And so in some ways, it's actually rather encouraging that some of the bigger organizations promoting these models are investing in some the guardrails and all of the infrastructure that goes around it. Google took a different approach initially. They held back. Google, in fact, are the authors of some of the technologies that underpin many of these large language models, but they intentionally have not launched their own offerings only until recently and in response to the firestorm of ChatGPT. So as many of you probably know, Bard, which is their version of, or at least their implementation of a chat-like interface using generative AI, will soon be integrated into their search. Meta they originally launched something called Galactica, which is a generative model around research papers, but it got pulled quite quickly because of some of the reasons that I mentioned on the previous slide. It was essentially giving incorrect information and they felt it was unsafe to keep released. And so now they've taken a slightly different tack. This week, I believe, they've released a large language model called Llama, and it's open for researchers with the specific aim of improving AI safety. And then finally, big science workshop. So you may have noticed that I've kind of, so far the examples that we've given have been with the vendor solutions, but there's a large open source initiative on this, and something called the Hugging Face platform is like an open AI platform. They have just launched something called Bloom as an open source or open access large language model. What's really interesting about this is how it's founded on their responsible AI license, but it's not yet ready, but it's a really promising initiative. So this is just to give you some kind of context that a lot of the activity right now that's ongoing in the field is around AI safety. So we could go to the next slide, please. So if you show someone ChatGPT, it's jaw-dropping when you first see it, and that's everybody is saying this is the next big thing, and it very likely is the next big thing. However, we have to have our hype goggles on somewhat. It's happened before. We've had different waves in AI where we've had a new paradigm or a new technology, and it's going to change the world, and everything. There are promises that are made, which unfortunately, when real world application comes into play, they don't manifest. So I'm not saying that this is definitely going to happen, more to have a sense of caution. The devil is in the detail, and the real world application of this technology is where we will see how effective it really will be. If we cannot solve the hallucination issues or cannot present it in such a way that they become less dangerous, then confidence may decline, and we may see another adjustment in the same way that we saw an adjustment with some of the other AI waves with new technologies. So you can go to the next slide, please. Right, so how can we use it in the social sector? So how long is a piece of string? There's human imagination being what it is. I'm going to give a few very cursory examples of the kinds of things rather than specific use cases, because uses in the social sector, it could be uses in any domain actually, but I've broken it down into three general areas. So human in the loop tasks. So if we take ChatGPT and we ask it to generate some content, I consider that an open kind of use case where we are literally letting it produce for us a block of text. Similarly, if we use an image generation tool, it's generating an image. In an open context like that, I think it's very, very important for social sector organizations to have a human in the loop, being trained on the internet. And as I mentioned earlier, we have potential issues with DEI, bias, factual correctness, and by that I mean the hallucination issue for text models that I mentioned earlier, as well as usage rights. There needs to be a human in the loop if you are going to leverage the amazing power of these models in an open way. So some examples are generating social media copy, images and text, not to replace a human, but to as an augmentation tool to help a human work more effectively and faster. Grant applications in the social sector, which can be, a lot of work. Using ChatGPT is an excellent way perhaps to simplify a paragraph, or to change the tense, or to correct grammar issues. GitHub Copilot, which is a tool that helps programmers generate code as a prompt. So if you start typing some code, it will generate the code for you afterwards. Is an amazing tool. There's already been a bunch of research on GitHub that shows that it is a workflow. From a workflow perspective, it's a huge improvement, or at least it can reduce the amount of time that you spend coding. However, human in the loop. It is not perfect. It will give you code that does not run. It will give you code that is not to high standards. So as a coder, you have to review what it presents to you. So human in the loop tasks, anything that's generating, you need to have a person putting a set of eyeballs on those. The next area to focus, I consider as targeted or safe tasks. So this is where we put guardrails, if you like, around the generative AI algorithm. For text, these models have learned an amazing ability to identify and understand deep structure within text, and that has many applications. One advantage of making the use a very targeted, specific use case like this is it's unlikely to open up to some of the dangers that we saw earlier. So the examples I've given here, we've done some work on predicting. So the Humanitarian Data Exchange has tens of thousands of data sets, and each one of those data sets has columns. The metadata or type of those columns, it would be really important to know what the type of each column is. So because that way, when there's a humanitarian disaster, you can link data sets together in a more effective way. And there's something called the Humanitarian Exchange Language, HXL standard. Point being, there's metadata that some people are setting on these data sets, which is incredibly useful, but for the majority, it's not set. So we've shown that if you use GPT-3, which understands language and language structure, we're able to actually predict those metadata tags. So it's a very targeted use case. It's not possible for it to surface racism or bias because it's just performing this very targeted task. And the same is true for these other two. So creating unit tests in Python have shown to be quite effective. And then the very last option here is searching through documents in a local store. It's called augmented search. So rather than using ChatGPT might not know about your internal documents and your internal information. So this is a mechanism by which we can bring the amazing power of ChatGPT, but constrain it to providing information or responding just on your internal documents. Then the third use case is to be totally open, unconstrained. So, So if unchecked, that opens you up to the hallucination, bias, and all of those other dangers that we mentioned earlier. So an example is to implement ChatGPT in a community healthcare app. This is dangerous, right? Because maybe a pregnant mother might be asking for information and they get the wrong information. Maybe it's medically, that's medically very dangerous. And there are all the other dangers that go with that. So right now, we do not recommend using unmoderated generative AI for open tasks in social sector applications. Cool, next slide, please. Right, so how to get started in generative AI for if you're a social sector organization person. The option one, which is somewhat humorous, is simply wait. Everything is on fire right now. Microsoft are almost certainly about, if not already, about to release many of the features that I've described earlier in the O365 suite, for example, meeting summaries, meeting plannings, things like that. I would envisage those coming out very soon. Similarly, Google, with Bard and Bing search engine. It goes on. So actually, just waiting a few months might be a nice way. If you're a social media person in a nonprofit, then it might be the case that you will have tools within vendor applications quite soon that will help you with your copy. For those that want to get in and start playing around with it, because social sector organizations will have use cases that might not align with those workflow examples I just gave. There are free credits. So OpenAI, I think, has $18 of free credit. It's a great way to get in and see what these things do and see how they feel, and to start analyzing and determining whether, is this going to be applicable to my to the communities that I'm trying to help. So free credits are a great option. Open source. So as I mentioned earlier, Hugging Face is an awesome platform. And there are many generative AI models on that platform. And there are basic ways that you can actually use them in situ. They present a web page and you can play around with them, and it's pretty cool, as well as download those models and run them yourself. And then the last option is get coding. Not just coding, by the way. If you have Google Spreadsheets, there are now vendor plugins for Google Spreadsheets that allow you to use generative AI in your sheets. So maybe you need to extract emails from blocks of text. Maybe you want to figure out organizations from blocks of text. Those kind of tasks can now easily be done in Google Sheets. In addition, if you have a text classification task in the work that you do, fine-tuning a model on OpenAI is a very easy exercise. It's actually somewhat more straightforward than going through a lot of the machine learning ops, ML ops workflow that you might have to do in curating your own model. So I would encourage that you start playing around with that. So there we are. That's a brief rundown on generative AI in the social sector.
Thank you, Matt. That was really fascinating and a super great overview of what's going on in this exciting and crazy environment right now. So I think I will, hi everybody, I'm John Harnisher. As we said earlier, I am the head of research at DataKind, and I'm going to lead us through some questions. Please keep putting the questions in the Q&A, as Shane has been saying in chat. We'll look through those and try to answer those as we move forward. I've got a few prepared questions for Michelle and Matt, and then we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can until Shana gives me the hook, and we'll move on to our close. So first, I think I'll ask the first question of you, Michelle. Matt did a good job of kind of giving an overview of some of the places where the currently available AI is somewhat safe to use, the kinds of things that we think you could use, especially with human human oversight and interaction, that there still is some work there that can be done in a very positive way. I was wondering what your thoughts are in that space and what things you might think are, hey, if you're coming in right now, these are relatively safe to do. Obviously, we'll go to the stuff that we might want to avoid as well.
Yeah, hi. So thanks for having me. I think there are a couple areas where generative AI is already making big strides. The first is, I think we already mentioned, in code generation, kind of a co-pilot type, I guess, applications where it can kind of produce like suggestions of code and code translations. That being said, Stack Overflow, for example, has banned ChatGPT produced answers because it has been so it has had like a pretty high probability of being wrong, even though it looks like it could potentially be right. That being said, I think having kind of a starting point in terms of code can be very helpful for people who are in programming like myself. And if it's used as a bit of like a GitHub Copilot type of a product, then it can kind of accelerate the programming process. The other thing is in kind of advertisement and in marketing, as well as kind of standard report generation where it's mostly kind of a routine task rather than producing completely brand new content. And I've read some news on exciting developments in like drug discovery and development in terms of identifying potential candidates and testing their efficiency with computer simulations, and that can expedite the process of discovering new drugs. Yeah, and there are tons of applications in terms of personalized lessons and in education and in course design, content creation, etc. So I think the use cases are quite exciting to think about, as long as we're mindful of the potential risks and issues that need to be mitigated and safeguarded first.
Excellent. Matt, anything to add to that?
I very much agree with Michelle about the co-pilot code generation. I was recently working with one of our amazing interns teaching some Python, and it was very interesting to see how that changed that paradigm. So in the world of Zoom calls, you're looking at the person typing, and as they would type, the code would appear. And it made me realize that, oh my goodness, this is amazing, but also a bit dangerous for the reasons that Michelle mentioned about Stack Overflow, as long as you look at it as a suggestion. But when somebody comes at it absolutely brand new, it can be, it can result in poor results because the person hasn't learned the basics. But a good educator, I think, would use that and adjust how you teach. And so that's what we've been doing. I also, Michelle, you raised a really fantastic point about science, and I didn't, the focus of my presentation didn't really focus on the amazing advances in science with generative AI. AlphaFold is possibly one of the biggest step forwards in molecular biology in the last 50 years, you know, in able to predict protein structures. There are others, there are many others, so it's the tip of the iceberg. For nonprofit specifically, the workflow time-saving elements, again, what Michelle said, creating content for marketing, creating content for grants, summarizing complex topics. I think those all show great promise as long as there's a human in the loop.
Awesome, cool. So some of the things that are going on in the world of AI revolve around, and Matt mentioned it earlier, this idea of humans tending to have an ability to talk about uncertainty when they don't know what is actually going on. Oh, I know about this area, but I'm taking a guess in that area. And with the generative AI, GPT chat and others, there's this ability to sound, right when you might, when they might be very wrong or having an hallucination or anything like that. So, Michelle, I wonder if you could start us off a little bit about what, the scope of that issue and what we might think about in terms of mitigating it as we're using or beginning to use generative AI.
Yeah, and I think this is something that was brought up in the presentation as well, in terms of ChatGPT having recorded instances of being hilariously wrong with a really strong level of confidence. And I think that is getting better. I have seen instances of ChatGPT kind of saying I made a mistake, or this, I'm not completely certain about this, or something, but those are kind of exceptions rather than the norm at the moment. Humans will generally say, like, qualify their answers with their kind of level of confidence, and true experts on a topic will understand not only their domain expertise, but also the boundaries of their knowledge and where they are starting to become less certain about their expertise. And ChatGPT is a bit lacking in that regard. And like I said, Stack Overflow has banned ChatGPT for that reason. There was like a chess expert that gave a long blog post about ChatGPT trying to play chess with him and making completely irrational moves with a perfect poker face. And there was a long kind of Twitter thread about this guy who asked what's the most frequently cited economics paper, and ChatGPT made a paper up based on words that are frequently used in econ papers. So it has the potential to spread misinformation because of its false sense of confidence. And the informational page for ChatGPT even explains that the challenge is because there's no real source of truth, and training the model to be more cautious causes it to decline questions that it can answer correctly. And for ChatGPT, where it's kind of more for demo purposes, it could be sensible to err on the side of answering a question wrong rather than saying, I don't know. But in a lot of the real world applications, there can be greater cost and potential harm to a wrong answer than a non-answer declining to answer. And that level of caution required can be different depending on the topic that's considered. And in order for the users to trust the outputs of generated text, it can't be equally confident about all the topics. But I think that the challenges of that is that if there's no single sense of truth, like you can't really explain how you got to that answer.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah, I think it's for language models, it's the biggest barrier at the moment. And I think it will be solved either through, I mean, if you look at OpenAI right now, the investment that is going into ChatGPT is less around the foundation model and at the very core of it, although of course that is ongoing as well. It's around the reinforcement learning that they put around ChatGPT to try and address these issues. And I'm sure that other organizations are doing the same. Although I will say it's a bit of a strange paradox here, because on the one hand, it feels somewhat unnerving to have companies owning these models, these proprietary models that we don't have transparency on. But on the flip, they're the only people that can afford to use 100 million people to train and improve safety of these models. So I'm somewhat conflicted. You know, on the one hand, I think it's amazing that those investments are being made right now. But I mentioned in the presentation, Bloom, an open source initiative, amazing. But I do wonder if they're going to have the resources to train models and the resources for human in the loop reinforcement learning to improve that open access offering. But it's the hugest thing. It has to be solved, and I'm optimistic that in the next few years there'll be some. And it may be not necessarily the model itself, maybe how it's presented. So instead of asking ChatGPT an open question where you just get an answer, I envisage with Bing and things like that, where we get something called augmented search, where it's actually corroborating its own answers as it responds, providing references to give you confidence that you can click, okay, where, so giving you an answer and then doing an internet search to see if it can add weight to its answer. So I'm wondering if we might see more solutions like that.
Yeah, I think that hits on another thing I was going to ask about, which is kind of the explainability of the information that's coming forward, right? So there's why you're really certain about this answer, which is one thing. Then we also don't know where it's coming from, and it isn't necessarily, you know, the idea of citing sources and understanding what actually generated this, so that if I'm taking this on as an answer to a question or as becoming a little bit more expert in an area, what is the source of that information that I'm using and that I'm taking in? So I wonder if you could comment on that one, Michelle, because I think that is very related to where Matt was just going.
Yeah, for sure. I think the key challenge is the lack of a clear information source, as it was mentioned. Because it's constructing sentences by making a series of guesses. That's the reason why large language models are called stochastic parrots. And I think there were some suggestions among academics that some language models like Atlas and Retro, that synthesize different sources to provide one answer should assign confidence levels based on each source's reputation, kind of like how in academic research we determine the reliability of information based on who we got it from and is it in a peer-reviewed journal, etc. And based on the sources, it could adjust the answer to express doubt, or it could say, okay, like I found a couple of different possible answers if there are sources that disagree on a topic. And especially for specialized topics, it could be worth considering what kind of a language model would be the most appropriate to be able to improve some of the explainability components. And lack of explainability also affects image generators in terms of where did you get this image from? It looks a whole lot like this artist's work, in which case copyright infringement issues can come up, and there have been artists boycotting apps for AI generated images for exactly replicating an artist's style or an artist's previous artwork. And there are steps being taken in that direction. There's one tool called Stable Attribution that says it's trying to decode an AI generated image's potential sources, but there's still more work to be done in that space to try to explain where did you get that image from, or where did you get that information from. And it's much more challenging just because of the nature of how these are trained compared to like AI assistants like Siri or Alexa that rely on internet search engine.
Matt?
It's wow, thanks, Michelle, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's huge, isn't it? It's until it's solved. But one thing I will say is that there were some very dramatic failures in the last year. For example, Galactica, which got pulled, but then we seem to have reached some sort of momentum where, and maybe this is I'm not the person to make the decision whether it was the correct ethical thing to do or not, to put ChatGPT live, but in starting to roll these things out into products, there's a really tricky balance, isn't there? Because I mean, take Bing recently, the ChatGPT enhanced Bing Sydney, I think it's called internally. One of the first things that's happened is the number of interactions a user can make with that augmented search engine has now been limited, because you had lots of journalists and people trying to get the chatbot to say really crazy things. But in a way, that's actually an interesting result. Maybe that's what you have to do as a first port of call. And maybe we're seeing an evolution where some of that safety will emerge in terms of the negative publicity that you get. No commercial organization wants to be associated with that, so they're going to invest very, very heavily in it, but only once it's actually live in the public domain. But the flip side of that is, of course, it can do terrible damage. So I don't quite know where that balance point is, but I see sort of pros and cons of both.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to switch tactics a minute before we go to the questions from those in the audience. One thing that you mentioned, Matt, and I think actually Michelle mentioned it as well, is this this real ability to change the life of people who work with code, and that there is this ability to generate and compile and put together all sorts of work that can help in a coder's day-to-day life. I'm wondering what you see. I'll start with you, Matt, maybe for this one, since you mentioned it earlier. What you see in terms of changes for coders who are already up and running and maybe are sort of expert or somewhat expert in a language, and then potentially you mentioned also training, how it might affect the training of folks who are getting into this field and who are practicing it every day.
I can speak from my own experience in that, I mean, I use Copilot every day. I have to write quite a bit of code, but I look at it very cautiously, and I definitely don't accept everything that it suggests in any shape or form. But I do find it useful. It probably reduces the amount of time I spend simply from the action of typing sometimes, probably by about 10 to 20%. And I think that's a huge impact if I can get that time back. So I think it has immense promise. But where it starts becoming funny, and I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier slides, unforeseen feedback loops on society in general. So Copilot is using something called the Codex model, which is trained on the content that's on GitHub, where most of the world's code is stored. So it's able to leverage and learn coding techniques based on that massive community. But if the massive community starts using Copilot going forward to generate their code, does that now, as Michelle mentioned earlier, that might have a negative feedback effect, because then Codex is going to be eating its own tail, in effect, that it's going to be using more and more code that was developed by Codex. So does that stifle innovation? Does that stifle developer? And I'm able to apply a lens to it and use it not wisely, but use it discerningly. But I do wonder if it's going to have a negative feedback in the longer term.
Anything to add to that, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I've personally reviewed a lot of poorly written code, so for the sake of my future, I would prefer if it got trained on like stylistically well written code. I mean, I remember in my undergrad and computer science classes, we were rated equally on functionality and style, so to enforce a lot of these best practices. Yeah, I do agree on the potential for that feedback loop and potentially hindering innovation. But in terms of, I guess at the moment, its main role and effectiveness is in like providing kind of a starting point of ideas for experienced programmers. It's not really something that someone who is a brand new to computer science can use and build something from scratch at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to switch to, I've been reading through some of the questions coming in from our participants, and there are so many and they're so great. We won't get to all of them, but I'm trying to sum one up that I think I've seen through a lot of the questions. And it's sort of in the area of what could we do, what could people in the social sector do to try to make an impact, a positive impact and a positive change on these AI models to potentially make them more fair, less biased. And it seems like a lot of the questions are kind of in that area of who are the people that we need to get involved to help. So I don't know, Michelle, if you want to start with that one, but it's that sort of the question a lot of the questions seem to stem around, well, what can we do to reduce some of these problems? And then who are those folks that we should be able to try to bring into the process to make, to push these generative AI models in the right direction?
Yeah, I think one problem that we haven't touched on as much is on kind of bias in sources. So ChatGPT does have content moderation guardrails in place to try to prevent sexual, hateful, violent, harmful content. But there have been a lot of examples of when these have been easily bypassed by kind of rephrasing the prompts. And it can now, I think just by saying, tell me a story about XYZ, it would tell you how to make a bomb or like how to commit fraud and a lot of kind of content that should have been filtered out by the moderation module. There was also an app that generates artistic avatars that went under controversy because it tended to sexualize women's images, and that tended to be more extreme for minority women. And I think there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of identifying biases and training data sets, not just in generative AI, but like in AI in general. That was my PhD topic as well. So it's an active area of research. I think one thing that, well, two things that could really help is one in like kind of more caution around curating and testing the training data set rather than just ingesting massive amounts of convenient, easily scraped kind of internet sources, and trying to understand what is this being trained on, what is it focusing on. And I think explainability kind of also would help in that, in terms of trying to understand where a lot of these like sources are coming from. And I guess the second thing is, in a way, having ChatGPT and DALL-E and all of these that are kind of like widely out there allows diverse groups of people to try to test it and identify some of these biases, and having kind of a more diverse development community and testing community would kind of help uncover some of these issues earlier versus later.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think what's really interesting about the ChatGPT training that's going on right now with all of the 100 million users is I do hope that that will be amplified as and when it's integrated, for example, into Microsoft's products. So now you're talking about billions of users around the world. I do hope that when it is integrated with those products, those users are given the voice and opportunity to be able to provide feedback in situ within applications. So it's not just a volunteer feedback. So right now you have to volunteer to go and use GPT. You're now going to get everybody around the world who has to use Microsoft maybe for their job, etc. I just really hope that those feedback workflows and those training workflows are integrated as part of that, with the aim of improving and mitigating those risks that Michelle just mentioned.
Yeah, thanks. One or a question that's come up and it's been mentioned a few times also is this this very small number of organizations that can actually have the power to run these models and to create these really fascinating and powerful products. And that is becoming more concentrated and less that there's less democratization and equitability, access. Like a lot of questions are in that space, and I'm wondering if either of you have comments around that. I mean, what could be done about that? How could we, who are in the nonprofit and social space, be thinking about what our impact there could be and how we could potentially have where does this go and what could we possibly do? Matt, you want to jump in first?
Sure. So in terms of model training, I mean, it's interesting that Meta just released Llama, and one of the aspects of that is that they want it to be accessible to people with limited computing resources. Apparently, allegedly, it will run on one GPU. So that's really great. And their whole point there is to democratize the use of that model, to open it up to more researchers, because there's a big problem here is that the research institutions might not have the resources that the commercial institutions have to train these ginormous models. So I'm really happy to see that there's at least some effort being made. I would hope that that would increase. On the flip, and this is an interesting thing we didn't really mention, if you're a small social sector organization, you are able to call an API and get state-of-the-art artificial intelligence for a small subscription fee. That means you don't have to have servers to train your models in-house. You don't have to manage rolling those out to production. Now, those APIs have been around for some time, but they are so very convenient. And I know that's not quite your question, but it's a kind of interesting point. It lowers the barrier, actually, to being able to access world-class AI resources.
No, I think that's actually a really important one, and it's maybe not one that everyone on this call is aware of. So to think about the what, we're trying to think about what can we do also, right? So that having that available to, easily accessible, I think is a great point. Michelle?
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are strides being made to kind of use one pre-trained model and make tweaks to it to kind of spin off different models rather than training a new one from scratch. We talked a bit about environmental impacts, but there was a study that showed the training one large transformer model emitted 284 tons of carbon dioxide versus an average human is responsible for 5 tons of carbon dioxide a year. So it is quite a significant environmental cost if we are spinning a ton of these up at scale. And I think being able to use kind of one model and spin off different use cases would help on one end. And on the other end, being more careful about the data that you're curating and training it on, rather than kind of using larger and larger convenience sample data sets. would also kind of help limit the environmental impact and also cost and efficiency issues.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we are ending the amount of time that we have for questions and answer. I really appreciate the conversation. I know we could do this a lot longer. There's many, many more things we could discuss. The questions themselves indicate how much excitement there is here and how this is really having a big moment for us. So I will turn it back over to you, Shayna, and thanks everyone again.
Yes, and huge thanks to our speakers again. Recognizing there were so many great questions in the chat, we definitely want to take a look. There may be sufficient demand to continue this conversation. We will be sharing a recording and slides of the presentation. Some of you mentioned interest in volunteering for us. You'll start to see some links in the chat if you're interested in that. If you want to stay up to date with all things happening with DataKind, including volunteer opportunities, other news and updates, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And then also, we want to hear from you. How did this conversation go? What worked well? What can we improve on? So we have the QR code here that you can put your phone up to give us feedback. We also have the link in the chat as well. So again, want to thank everybody for joining us. We will be providing the recording and slides. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.